Chasing Leviathan is a podcast about pursuing truth, one big question at a time through the discipline of listening. Truth is too big to tame, but if we pay close attention, we might get the chance to glimpse something truly magnificent. So please join me in this pursuit, 1 week at a time. Hello and welcome to Chasing Leviathan. I'm your host, PJ Weary, with Dr. John Modern, the Arthur and Catherine Shadek Professor of Religious Studies and producer of Machines in Between, a collaboration between artists, scholars, scientists about our increased entanglement with machines. And also the author of Neuromatic, which is the book we're going to talk about today, A Particular History of Religion and the Brain. Dr. Modern, thank you so much for coming on today.
Thank you, PJ. I'm very happy to be here. It's nice to meet you. And hello, everybody out there in the virtual world. Well, you're not virtual. You're listening. You're real right now, listening. You're not virtual. You're virtual to me, though.
Yes. Which is, that's an interesting take right from the start. But before we get too far into the weeds, tell me why Neuromatic? Why this area of study for you?
Okay, well, thank you. I spend my day job as a professor of religious studies. I've sort of studied religion. I sort of got into it as an undergraduate, majored in religion, got a master's in comparative religion, PhD in religious studies, professor of American religious history. And I think in the past 10 or 12 years, I began to sort of reorient a little bit of my focus toward, I guess, the contemporary technological scene and try to think about what does that history look like? Because I think in a lot of ways, the current moment that we are in strikes me as a situation that is ripe for a certain kind of applied conversation that I have learned as a student of religion, thinking about people like Durkheim or Freud or Du Bois or James or, these sort of classic theorists who I find myself in conversation with. My goal has been, I think, to sort of bring that conversation to the contemporary moment where, it's hard to describe. I mean, I think part of its indescribable intensity and accelerating pace has really sort of struck me as something that, a kind of basic sociological or even a sort of basic sort of philosophical sort of precise analysis of the contemporary condition. Although I like those, I thought it would be a little bit more fun to sort of think about how might religion be thought through this technological moment. And so my last book, Neuromatic, A Particular History of Religion and the Brain, is a history of one of, I think, the major nodes of our contemporary moment, which is the investment in the brain as both a kind of epistemological horizon of what we can know about ourselves and the world and the universe. And it's also become, in terms of popular culture, a way, I think, where, not just scientists or people who are interested in the neuroscience aspect are beginning to sort of adopt certain kinds of models of personhood or subjectivity that I think are very much derived from the history that I try to tell, which is a sort of 300-year genealogy of the contemporary neuroscience and cognitive science of religion. So that's kind of where I'm at. It's sort of derived from my last book, which was called Secularism in Antebellum America, in which I spend about probably 30, 40 pages thinking through the invention of the faculty of spirituality among phrenologists in the mid-19th century, and seeing that as a real kind of major moment in the kind of prehistory of our current sort of fascination and obsession with the brain and its secrets.
Yeah, even as you were talking there about this history of neuroscience, immediately it made me think. I had an interview with Paul Craddock on the history of transplant surgeries, and I was stunned to find how much of our medical ethics that we take for granted, how young they were. Like permission for body parts is like that I kind of bodily autonomy, while not in, maybe an older idea, has not really been implemented in medicine like until like 50, 70 years ago. And that, and even today, like in other parts of the world, like not always followed through on. And so, when you talk about the history of neuroscience, one of the things that, I'm looking through the book, you're talking about electroshock therapy and the kind of the history there. Our image of neuroscience can often be one of authority, of stability and safety, and very ethical. And that is not, I don't want to get into a tangle with neuroscientists today, but the history of it is undeniably not that.
Well, yeah, and I think that's one of, in a sense, and so, like, to step back, like, my book is not arguing with neuroscientists and cognitive scientists at the level of their sort of measurements of blood flow in the brain through an MRI, or, taking them to task for sort of mismeasuring some electrical wave or something like that, or, I'm not a trained neuroscientist, but I am an historian, and I'm thinking of a pretty good one. And, my constant question is for my students, for my colleagues to, it's my bias, but I think we would all be a little better off if we thought a little more historically, which for me is a kind of Foucauldian project. It's not simply going to the archive and finding the things that sort of prove an argument that you want to say something happened in the past. I'm one of those sort of weird historians, where the historians don't even recognize me as a historian. That guy's a theorist, right? But I'm deeply enmeshed in all manner of archives. I am an obsessed collector, an obsessed archivist, where I really do, kind of think about the question a lot about what are the conditions of possibility that allows my line of inquiry, that makes my question make sense to me and those around me, right? And, it's just that basic kind of, sort of a kind of a reflective sort of approach to the kind of epistemological conditions, right? Which is a Foucauldian project, right? And so I've been thinking through that, and Neuromatic in my previous book as well, to try to think about, like, what is our common sense? What is our common sense about religion? What is our common sense about the brain? What is the common sense about who we are as humans and our potential? And I'm very interested in sort of illuminating a kind of, a long genealogy of that, right? Not to sort of negate it or challenge it, but to sort of hopefully supplement it. And where, I think in my larger claim to the neurosciences and cognitive science, although I'm really skeptical, particularly of that kind of science being applied to something like religion or religious cognition, or, some people call spiritual cognition or something like that, I think it would behoove all of us, particularly the scientists, to sort of take into account what I call the ecological confound of history and culture, right? The way in which history and culture do make their way in, only into your sort of scientific notion of objectivity, but perhaps into your laboratory as well. And just like some dust or some dirt or high humidity in the laboratory might mess up your experimental design, there's something about the way in which language, right, mediates us.
Yes.
Absolutely. And it would, not to escape it, but to sort of have a more subtle understanding of perhaps what the limits of one's inquiry can produce.
Those projects that try to escape language, I think, are, there have been a few attempts, but they don't seem to work, right? So that's not the goal, but the goal is to understand what's happening to us. Apologies.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah. Have you ever read Don DeLillo's Great Jones Street?
No, I have read Don DeLillo, though, so I'm familiar with the style. Yeah.
Yeah, this is a deep cut from, I think it's like early 70s. It's about a sort of rock and roll star, sort of based on like kind of quasi Mick Jagger, Bob Dylan, who goes into a retreat. His name is Bucky Wunderlich. And the whole novel revolves around his desire to lose his language. Right? And looking for this drug that he can take, which will basically erase all of his language and all that implies, and be able to start from scratch. Anyway.
There you go. Yes.
The attempt to escape. Yeah.
Is that, you said Great Jones Street?
Great Jones Street. Yeah. I plug that. It's great. I get $1 every time he sells a copy.
There you go. I was looking over here and I was listening to what you're saying. I love how the detail of it. You start with this prologue talking about the study you took part in, and I wanted to find it because I wanted to reference it. You talked about how you were folded in as a part of the control group, and you became this anonymous, and you gave the actual number that you were assigned, and it was just such a great example of like how the language, like, well, if you have a number, not a name, then we have removed bias, right? Um, was that a big part of this, though? Taking part in that study, was that a big part of your turn here?
Yeah, the book actually began in the early, like 2012, 2013, when I was participating in this program called New Directions in the Study of Prayer. It was sponsored by the Social Science Research Council. And it was a bunch of people for a few years getting together talking about prayer, and like 50 people in all these different kinds of disciplinary registers. And my project at that time was to think about prayer machines. And one of the things I was pitching for that project was to visit cognitive and neuroscientific labs and to sort of see how they're studying prayer. And sort of make a long story short, it sort of evolved a little bit. And some of the early, I participated in the experiment that you mentioned that sort of is the prologue of my book, which is a laboratory of Dr. Patrick McNamara in Boston University, a leading voice in the neuroscience of religion. And I also participated, well, I didn't participate so much as observe in the University of Aarhus in Denmark at a place, kind of a multidisciplinary place called the Mind Lab that was up and running there for a number of years. I spent 2 summers sort of hanging out with some of the cognitive science there, talking to them and sort of trying to get a real take of like what's happening, because the conceit, as the book starts in the present, it starts with me in the MRI, right? Me thinking about the history of neuroscience and cognitive science in the MRI, and I have a picture of my brain to prove that I was thinking about all these things. And if you have the eyes to see, maybe you can sort of dissect and actually sort of see how and why I was thinking about religion and cognitive science. But these experiences, although I'm not a trained ethnographer, I'm a historian and a writer, they were just amazing. I learned so much, and they really, kind of gave me, a lot of appreciation of the power of their science, and the sort of, the kind of reach that they were really, the sort of real epistemic desire to know things. And as a scholar of religion, I go back 25 years, I've studied a lot of people who have a deep, intense desire to know something that is not obvious, that is not on the surface, that one needs to erect rituals and programs and communities by which one can begin to get into that space of knowing that, right? And so as a general level, when I was with the cognitive and neuroscientist, it's a crass statement of, well, they're just like religion. That's not what I'm saying, nor I think is a very interesting point, but it's to sort of just see them as human beings who are living in this world, just like all the other human beings who have lived in this world, who are subject to the particularities of their culture, their moment, et cetera, et cetera. And so, and to sort of figure out how they particularly are enacting through belief and practice their, I call it a metaphysics, right? I think we all do kind of walk around with some first principles and some first assumptions that are indefensible, and that's fine, right? But we should recognize them, and to recognize those perhaps as biases, and maybe double down on them if we believe in them, but to have more sort of meta conversations about how we walk around with these sort of metaphysical assumptions that we're carrying with us all the time.
And I think that in many ways, when you're with this book, you talk about rejecting that first principle or that final aim, which is that that communication happens in a purely statistical fashion. I think that's the quote, right? And so this you're not rejecting their work, but you are maybe circumscribing it. Is that a fair way to talk about it?
I think so, and with a kind of cautionary, I don't have any grand visions of the impact of my work. John Modern wrote a book that questions the sort of metaphysical assumptions of the neuroscientific project or the Neuromatic project. Oh, we're gonna stop and do something different now. I'm not sure about that, but the circumscription I think is a nice way, because my hope really truly is to sort of produce better cognitive and neuroscientists of religion, right? These are the people who come to my conferences and say things, and I would like to be in conversation with them. And I've read a lot of their work, and I always sort of say, maybe you might want to read some of mine, and maybe we can talk.
When you so can you define neuromatic for our audience, or at least in a rough
Yes.
sense?
Yeah, so my book is titled Neuromatic, which is also, as I've found out since publishing, is the name of a band in England.
Nice.
We kind of get our tweets mixed up and things like that. It's also, I found a VHS tape from 1999 on a weight control VHS tape called Neuromatic and Behavioral Control. So I'm not the first one. I thought I was sort of coming up with a new coining a new term, but maybe not. But the neuromatic basically kind of signifies, I think, which is at the heart of my genealogy, which is sort of in the mid 20th century. I talk about I call it a consequential integration of two different sort of theoretical framings of reality in the human. One being in the form of information theory as it is developed by Claude Shannon in the 1930s and 1940s, published very famously in a couple articles in the Bell Laboratory Manual or Journal, I forget exactly what it's called, in the late 1940s. But already in the 1940s, scientists are aware of this kind of development where, an incredible sort of advance in mathematics is happening there. And at the same time, we have the development of a kind of what we might call just the basic paradigm of the brain as a neural network, as consisting of different kinds of neurons that are connected to each other in an all but infinite kind of sort of density. And so these two theories it's almost like chocolate and peanut butter in a lot of ways, although they are chocolate and peanut butter, both sweet treats, right? That have sugar in them, but they come together in a way that, for me, just looking at it, on one hand, really does sort of initiate and catalyze an incredible boom in neurophysiological research, in development of different kinds of paradigms of thinking about the brain as a collection of neurons that are connected, that process information. And with our new models, we can begin to understand not just the sort of form of the brain, we can begin to understand the processes of how the brain does its business. And, you begin to see that take off in the 1940s and 1950s. And at the same time, these two theories are also at the foundation of what we would call the digital revolution, the advance of computer science, the building of some of the first computers in the 1940s, like people like John von Neumann, who are literally reading the same articles and thinking about building a machine. And the other people are reading the same articles thinking about, well, how do we study a brain, right? And you begin to sort of think about that moment. And then you think about the last 75 years, how the computers and our brain have, in a sense, at least I'll put understandings of computers and our brain have basically kind of been in this kind of constant weird feedback loop, right? Building machines to recognize us as human beings based upon a neuromatic model, and basically understanding our brains in light of the computers that we're building and are increasingly surrounding us, right? And going back to my prologue in the beginning of the book, in a lot of ways, that's a very claustrophobic chapter, right? The MRI is a claustrophobic space. It's a space where you do feel a certain kind of heteronomy. You're not necessarily in charge of what's happening, and you are awash with a certain kind of force of not just the magnetism, but culture and history. And there's something about that feedback loop between the brain and the computer, which I think is a kind of thread that sort of courses through my entire book to the last page, where I kind of do this moment where I I'm writing to the reader, and I talk to the reader, and I'm like, I'm going to shut my computer down, not to escape language or to escape Neuromatic, but just to have a moment where maybe there's just something said or something, a word that might just give you not an escape hatch, but at least some kind of frisson that would allow you perspective upon the kind of claustrophobic condition of discourse that I think that we are in.
There's a couple different places that I makes me want to go to. I had someone on for an interview who talked about the different models of the brain, and I wish I could remember which interview it was, but when they talked about it, they talked about how when they first taught, they introduced, one model of the brain as software and hardware, and they would have to argue to their students that that was a possible model. And 20 years later, she now has to argue that it's not the only possible model, that like in those 20 years, like that understanding of the brain has become, and even you mentioned this when you say John von Neumann, is this the same kind of area as like the Turing test? I think it's Alan Turing, or is he earlier? I think it's around the same time, right? When we're talking about
Turing's 50. He's in the 40s doing his work for code breaking, but I think his machine intelligence is either 1950 or 1951, where he presents the Turing test, as we call it.
Which would be a logical outworking of this like these two things connecting, this chocolate and peanut butter, as it were.
Yeah, because, we're stuck with, obviously in the last few weeks or months, particularly within circles of higher education, and there's been a certain kind of moral panic about the introduction of these chatbots that, can represent and replicate student papers and coding and all this kind of notion. And, the majority of ink that is being spilled, I think is still very much, in a lot of ways, hasn't read, Alan Turing, right? His big insight was like, okay, what is the difference, or what how do we know when a machine is intelligent, right? It's a very subtle and sophisticated philosophical argument, but at the end of the day, he's like, well, if you kind of believe it's a human being and intelligent, well, then it is, right? And there's something about that kind of moment where I do sort of take this point very seriously, the idea that we can spend a lot of time trying to like demarcate the differences and distinguish between like, well, a machine does this and humans do this, and try to figure out that kind of thing. But, Turing was like, what? We are going to build our humanity into these machines, and these machines will reflect our humanity back, right? And so he, in a lot of ways, although, he's not a Foucauldian by any sense of the means, there's a way in which he does sort of point to a space that I think is the contemporary moment, right? Where, I don't know. I'm not. I don't really care if these machines are sentient, right? That's not the question. The question is to what degree human beings are changing themselves, envisioning a future kind of human, and enacting that kind of plan, right? And is that the best plan for us, right?
Right.
Because it seems like right now, this is a whole other conversation. I just look at the newspaper for the past 15 years, and things aren't going so great. At least for these kinds of ideals that we hold sort of, have held up, reason and equality and truth, whatever the Enlightenment was in its sort of best formation, we can kind of get into, the limits and, all those sort of, jagged ways, imperialism and yes, but, I guess I'm an old man, but there's something about truth and reason that I think are valuable, or at least aspire to. Right.
Yes.
And it seems to me that we're living in a world where, like, I'm not even pretending to sort of understand it, but whatever that sort of foundation is slipping away or transitioning into something else. And I think it has a lot to do with the way in which we're constantly looking at our phone. Right. And I say that as a kind of outrageous thing, but every time you swipe your phone, there is a neuromatic affirmation. Right. The phone recognizes you, imagines you as a neuromatic phenomenon. Right. And it's because it's built as a neuromatic phenomenon. And you begin to sort of create reality through your encounter with this sort of machine that is imagining your humanity and allows you to imagine your humanity over and over again in a particular register. You do that enough times and among enough people, well, That's how social constructions are made real.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah. And social constructions are real, right? Like that's
Yes, they are. They can fucking kill you, right?
yes.
They can totally kill
Yes.
you, right?
100%.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Oh man. Um yeah, it's really interesting like for people who don't understand social construction, but when I've had those conversations, and a lot of times it's just a lack of research in that area, just to mention the dollar, and then like, oh yeah, that's real, that matters. You know what I mean? And it's like, I mean, that's an agreed upon number, right? Like, like created by multiple forces. Very similar here. Go ahead. Do you have a
No,
thought?
no, I
Or,
was just thinking, I was telling my students, like, why can you go to Taco Bell and get a bean burrito for $4? Why, what is that? What is going on there to sort of get them to think about this? The idea that, I think this is the hardest sell to scientists, right? Some of the harder scientists that I talk to have no patience for my commitment to a certain sort of non-essentialism about the world, right? The idea that things are real and they have physical effects, but I also believe that they don't have to be that real. There could have been another reality, right? We could change this reality, right? And I learned this in grad school from another amazing book that I also want to give a shout out, Michael Tossig's Mimesis and Alterity, which was this book that I was reading in graduate school among all my colleagues were talking in a buzz about this book. And he has this first few pages where it's kind of called like a prologue or a message to the academy. And it's kind of this nice quippy thing where he's like, of course everything is a social construction. That's the first principle. Like he's kind of arguing with people who like write a whole book and at the end like, and everything is a social construction, right? And you're just like, that's like, well, yeah, like that's the thing that gets you into the work. Then you get to see how it gets constructed. Then you get into the mechanics of construction, how those mechanics have constructed you. And it has this sort of, dare I say it, a kind of utopian political project where there is this assumption that if we can get into the brass taxes of how things have been made, maybe we can remake them.
Hopefully better.
Hopefully better.
Yes.
But at least,
yeah.
I mean, at this point, maybe I could see an argument like, well, John, things are going quite well. We don't need to change. Don't rock the boat. Things are going great, right? And I'm like, yeah, they're
sure
wonderful. just wonderful.
No matter who I talk to, that is not a common opinion. I will say that. Like maybe from a 200-year look at things, people might argue for that, but not in the last, like if you look 10 years, like there's definitely seems to be that kind of dip. Yeah, you mentioned a little bit in your book about this, and it seems to kind of ring with what you're talking about with reason and truth in this pursuit. And you mentioned like the jagged empiricism. I like that term. That's how it, in the soft, squishy parts of my brain, that's what it feels like. When we talk about finitude and epistemology, in some ways, when you look at like the Cartesian project, there's this work towards mathematics and certainty. And then you're talking about it's worth aspiring to truth and reason, and we don't want to lose that best formulation of what the Enlightenment project was. And you weren't sure what's going on today and where some of this is coming from. Do you think there was a realization that we could not escape our finitude, and it's almost that to me, like to really make it down to earth, it sometimes feels like we've decided to take our ball and go home, to just sour grapes it and be like, well, if I can't reach that, and I never will, then I'm not even going to try. Do you feel like that's some of what's happening?
So on the ground, in terms of this kind of destabilizing of these sort of traditional sort of ways of argumentation and, kind of the sort of ideal of the Habermasian public sphere where we can sort of reasonably debate with each other. Gosh, I don't know. I mean, that's almost outside my bailiwick to sort of make a kind of like, this is what's happening to the culture. But, I think one of the things I'll sort of take that question. One of the things that a lot of people in my book, where I do this kind of gonzo genealogy of the neuroscientist, which includes not just a lot of scientists, but very deliberately a lot of people and figures and moments that I think sort of established scientists would be like, they have nothing to do with me. I have nothing to do with Scientology. I have nothing to do with parapsychology. I have nothing to do with phrenology. I have nothing to do with, Emanuel Swedenborg. What is this person saying? Because there's something about the book that sort of gets in there, and I think in a lot of ways, this history reminds us that we do have a finitude, right? There's a certain kind of ending that happens, and we build upon the bodies and the minds of the dead, right? And there's something about the project in general that I noticed, and I'm teaching a class right now which has to do with some of this stuff, and we've had some big conversations about there is this kind of weird desire for immortality, a desire to escape finitude within the neuromatic, right? Among, for example, L. Ron Hubbard and the Scientology rituals, right? There's, that's a religion that's doing that. But I also see it among neuro and cognitive scientists where you have an extreme example in the form of like a Ray Kurzweil, or those individuals who are really into the notion or the prospect of a kind of moment of singularity where there is this kind of full integration of whatever the human was and whatever the machine was into this new reality where we will be like gods on some level. But that godlike immortality is dependent upon, a real reduction of ourselves to the neural networks that process information and don't have much room for the body. They don't have much room for those spaces in human life that do not make sense at the moment and perhaps may never make sense according to a mathematical model. And again, going back to our earlier, I think that's a metaphysical position, right? Because I can see a lot of cognitive neuroscience and computer scientists coming to me like, well, John, you can say anything you want. Our stuff works. It works, right? Did you see that machine? Do you see that sort of, degenerative neural disease that we've come up with a way to explain and also treat and counteract? And I stand, I'm like, sure, right? That's wonderful. And again, I am all for MRIs, and I'm all for, all for people if they have some issue and they don't want to be that way, and there's some doctor or some machine that can tell you why you're that way and perhaps even give you some guidance about how to move someplace else. The plasticity of the brain and the human is quite real. The problem that I have is when, again, you begin to take stuff like religion, which seems, I understand when, somebody like, well, John, this cup is not a social construction. And you're like, okay, but religion, hope, morale, these things are obviously social constructions, right? It's that kind of angle that I'm always sort of trying to sort of poke and be like, we do have bodies that decay, that are messy, that we have that are representative of a certain kind of entropy of what reality kind of is, right? And I kind of want to insist that there's maybe some old school existentialist in me, right? Just embrace it, right? You'll be better off. You'll be happier. The time you have on Earth will be so much more fulfilling. As if that you can, if you premise your life on this prospect of escaping, of getting out of. I just think you're going to ask them questions that aren't fully thought through or unpacked. Maybe might be my way to say it.
And that, you're talking about bodies. You're talking about instead of trying to dig our way out, maybe dig our way in. Maybe would this be an appropriate moment to ask? You mentioned earlier about rituals that dig deeper, about people who want to know more, and that seemed to be in some ways, I wouldn't say opposite, but maybe metaphysically apart from this kind of neuroscientific model. Can you talk a little bit about what you mean by those rituals and what their value is and what they do, what they are? Maybe some concrete examples.
Well, I think the first thing I would say, in terms of keeping with my book, there's little that escapes the sort of neuromatic touch in our contemporary culture in a lot of ways. But obviously not everything is encompassed by it. So, there's a chapter in my book that I deal with, for lack of a better term, the sort of weirdos, the demimonde of the neuromatic, where I have a chapter on parapsychology, Scientology, and the writers and artists William Burroughs and Brian Geisen. And I put that chapter in the middle of my book, not as, a kind of alternative to the Neuromatic, but for these individuals who worked through it in ways that I think were differently inflected. And so, for example, a ritual that I find quite powerful is the ritual of writing and artistic creation. And that's something I, have taken a lot from Burroughs, and I deal a lot with he and Brian Geisen and another artist named Ian Somerville. Basically invented or sort of came up with this thing called the dream machine in the early 1960s. And it was based in part upon the stroboscopic light experiments that were being done by Gray Walter in his neurophysiological research, where he would subject subjects to these flashing lights as a way to sort of begin to sort of see how those lights affect brainwaves and to begin to ask questions about how brainwaves are perhaps responding to or even anticipating different kinds of flashes of light. And so they come up with this kind of like DIY thing, which is 78 RPM turntable. You put this sort of cylindric sort of cardboard cutout with these holes in it. You put a bright light in the middle. You start spinning it, and you go up to it and you close your eyes, just like you would in a Gray Walter experiment. But the purpose was a kind of disassociation. The purpose was, in a lot of ways, run through the sort of logic of the Neuromatic. This dream machine works precisely because your brain does emit electrical currents at a particular kind of frequency. And here's a device that can, in a sense, affect those. And they use it not to, in a sense, achieve a kind of immortality or perhaps even find something out that is going to have a kind of promise of security or any kind of guarantee like that. They do it to, in a sense, destabilize themselves, right? There's a kind of desire to sort of go into a moment where you do begin, at least momentarily, to slough off perhaps ways in which you might have known otherwise, and perhaps create conditions by which you might know differently. And so that, for me, is a ritual that is quite different than a lot of the rituals that I saw in practice among those who were, let's say, practicing the Neuromatic. And one of the things that this book, I've been in conversation with a number of different people about this book, and often the conversation turns toward the writing, because I'm very self-conscious about myself as an author in this book, very much sort of talking about myself and talking about the process of writing. And, I'm in a kind of an old school romantic. I believe there's something really precious and special about a space where you can begin to be, I don't want to say alone with your language, but, in a space where you can begin to sort of work through the way in which language has begun to make you up, right? And I think just getting there, for me, I think if you get there, I would find it hard to then go out into the world and begin to sort of do these sort of projects that depend upon a vision of the human as, at the end of the day, a disembodied, perhaps immortal, sort of computational entity. You begin to think about, we're weird, man. We got weird stuff inside us. Freud told us this.
Yes.
But we don't teach Freud anymore in psychology. He's wrong. He's obviously wrong. He's wrong.
And that's it's real. I was actually, I like to think of myself as an open-minded person, and then I was rebuked. Someone was talking about, I'd read the Neuroscience by Jean-Baptiste Vico, and I was like, this is weird. I don't get it. And he got so many things wrong. And someone came along and talked about the fundamental insight was that you could create these analyses of the human condition, like it's the birth of anthropology. And I missed it because I got bogged down in the wrong details, right? And that's like the reason I say this is because that's Freud all over, right? Like you get bogged down in I read his essay on the Uncanny, and he's like, it's about castration. I'm like, it doesn't always have to be about penises, right? Like, right? And you look at it like the guy's a little obsessed, comments about him smoking cigars, that sort of thing. But to look at that and to recognize that the fact that he was fundamentally right about the subconscious, and that we are messy and not easily folded into these statistical boxes. it's almost so basic now, and then we're like, well, we're going to get beyond that, and we're going to find better boxes instead of like recognize what the truth of what he's saying. Does that track with what
Yeah,
you
and I
kind of
think
go there?
yeah, I
Yeah.
think there's also there's a tragic. I mean, Freud has no utopic vision. He's like humans are at the end of the day irrational, animalistic creatures who want to, fuck, kill, and eat each other,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like that's sort of the vision, and there's no escaping that, right? That's just the human condition, and which, first of all, that just turns most people off. They're like, no, which is really, really interesting, right? I mean, you think about like, the kind of how non-palpable Freud is in this contemporary moment
Yeah.
with his vision, right? And I often think about it's very similar when I teach Puritanism, and I really try to get down into the weeds of like, okay, here's a group of people whose commitment to their version of Christianity was premised on the fact that they could never know their God, and the fact that they could never know with a degree of certainty whether they are saved or not. you know and my students are like, what is that? Like, that sounds like, I go, yeah, in the beginning of time, God wrote your name down either in the book of life or not, and has nothing to do with you. You have no idea why. And they're just like, what is this? Like, why would anybody want to join that? And I'm always like, there's something, I don't pretend to get into the mind of a Puritan, but I'm like, you can imagine there's something really exhilarating about living your life with that imagination of a kind of honesty about the sort of limits of what you can do. And, I think fast forward 400 years, I think in a lot of ways it's kind of the opposite, right? Where, you have a personal relationship with your divinity, right? You talk to your divinity. You this would be very foreign to a pure, like, what? That's what are you doing? That's not God then. You're just, that God is overwhelmingly outside. And so back to Freud, I mean, he's not a theologian on any level, but the idea that there is a deep irrationality at the heart of reality, which is, I mean, that's why he was so like he gave the lie to the kind of utopian project of arriving at reason, at arriving at truth, at arriving at stability. Like, it's a great goal. You should definitely try, and I have no problem with that. But let's do it with a degree of honesty when we try to do that kind of thing, which is very Jamesian too, right? He talks about the use of as a pragmatist, right? We use language and we don't believe in it, right? Right? Captain Ahab believed in his language, and look what happened to him and everybody who went on that boat with him, right? He believed absolutely in his language. He had some sort of notion that language was a kind of, had a certain kind of referential, direct correspondence to the world that we live in. And, look how that turned out.
I mean, that just goes back to your experience in the, and I always love these kinds of accounts because most people don't realize how messy the scientific process is. And so as soon as you start looking at an actual survey and not the results of the survey, it's like 50% of people believe this, right? And that seems just like this hard, cold fact. And we know it. We know it with certainty. And then I'm like, the questions you're being asked about religion, and like, those are messy, messy questions, right? And you can't just like fold this into like this certainty. I mean, it does get folded into this certainty, but it's an unwarranted certainty.
And it's a certainty that has the effect of certain. It's a certainty effect, right?
Yes,
It's like,
yes.
it appears real as the trees outside your window, right? Because it is these layered things where there are these, in the process you're talking about in the prologue, I'm subject to all manner of tests. It ends with the MRI, the kind of granddaddy of, measurement of my brain, blood in my brain. But it's preceded by a number of different kinds of just basic sort of psychological tests, the magical ideation scale, the post-critical belief scale. A spiritual biography is taken of me and put through a kind of, language recognition program to sort of measure my capacities for religious and or secular cognition. And it really is neat, right? It's neat, but its neatness is premised upon a certain kind of historical outcome that, for example, in the end of the 20th century, early 21st, most people, I would say, This is a wager. But I think if you wait, and this is true in my classes. My students arrive in class, not necessarily invested in religion or against religion, but whatever religion is, it has to do with belief, right? It has to do with your cognitive assent to certain doctrines, right? And this is not surprising. This is what the Supreme Court believes. This is built into our Constitution. But let us be truthful and be like, this is an incredibly Protestant, right, formulation, right, that has a history. That is not the only way to do it, right? And so when I was in that laboratory, I really felt like this kind of unexamined sort of notion that religion is real and we've figured out what it is. And now we know what religion is. We're going to find where that religion is in your brain, right? Which for me is just like, I think, and when we go to that point as a scholar of religion who really likes to think about the problem of religion or thinking about those who have talked about religion, this seems to end the conversation on some level, right? That the idea that we will, in fact, one day find, everything we need to know, and it's going to be mapped onto the brain, and won't life be lovely then?
Then obviously we'll be able to fix everything.
Oh, yeah. I mean, fix ourselves. Don't you want to fix yourself?
Yeah.
I mean, think of all those moments in your day. Like, why am I doing this? Why do I do this? This is not good for me. Why did I choose that? Why am I hanging out with this person? I mean, again,
yeah.
I mean, there's no fixing it, right? There's recognition, right? There's humility. There's these other sort of values that I think can be derived from this condition that we have that don't necessarily lead into this sort of desperate attempt to overcome those moments or issues or a predicament that promises no certainty, right?
I grew up independent fundamental Baptist. So,
okay.
So when you talk about assenting to doctrines, very, very familiar. No longer independent fundamental Baptist. And
I grew up Northern Baptist. Northern Baptist in Ohio. And I talk about that in my book a little bit in terms of my grandmother. I was raised in part by my grandmother, who was quite religious, and the book is dedicated to her, Dorothy Flay. And she was a really passionate sort of premillennial evangelical in so many ways, where talk of the rapture and the end of the world was quite prevalent in my household. And also, though, she suffered from clinical depression, undiagnosed, I think, in that term, but basically was hauled in for electric shock therapy in the early 1960s, and I'm not sure it helped her, in a lot of ways, but that sort of that notion of the doctrine. I remember, like, every first of every month during communion, we would read this sort of statement of faith, right? And I'd read it religiously, as it were, until I was about 14 or 15. Went to high school, and there was this line in it. It's like, I will not partake in the sale and use of alcohol as a beverage, right? And everybody is saying this, and I'm like, oh man, I went to that party last week and I had a beer, and I remember that was a moment where I'd be beside my grandmother and I'd be reading everything else. I won't kill anybody and I'll help everybody and all that kind of thing. And then we get to this line, I would just sort of like not say anything, as if I could opt out. It's like, I don't want to lie to God. I'm not gonna. But I was like kind of my own reformer. At 15, I'm like, okay, I'll take a little bit of that. I like this whole other thing, but I don't know about that.
Oh man. Yeah, and I think the thread through all this that I appreciate is you call it a particular history, right? And so even as we're talking about this is very particular. When you talk about the rapture, right? Like my granddaddy, which you want to talk about particular history, my granddaddy who lived in Ocala, Florida, Central Florida. I mean, any day now, those trumpets are going to sound. That was that was a common refrain. I think it's interesting that in our society, most people don't even realize it's the kind of that common metaphor of the water that the fish swim in. When we talk about this, you're talking about the Supreme Court and this Protestant assent to doctrines, right?
Even the
And
Catholics,
yes,
are assenting. It's like no, it's like
yeah,
that's the thing. It's not about Protestant faith. It's built into our language, right?
yes.
You know.
Um,
Um,
what would be an example of a different model of belief, or this different model of religiosity?
well, how about religion is about community? Religion is about bodies together in space. Ritual is about those moments of encounter of our sort of messy humanity together, right? Or perhaps another. I'm just talking out loud here. Maybe a model of religion that could be um, uh, basically committed to sort of divesting oneself of any belief, right? Of sort of going into that sort of performance art space where nothing is true and everything is permitted. I don't know, but there's ways in which this sort of commitment uh, to belief and cognition, it's also related to a certain understanding of language, right? That language can, in a sense, encompass a certain kind of doctrine, and you can, in a sense, participate in this language as a vehicle by which you can commune with your God, right? There's all different kinds of manners, right? And I was trained in part by continental philosopher Tom Carlson, and who was a student of Mark Taylor. Not analytic philosophers, but I think one of the funny things I always tell that I didn't realize there was such a thing as analytical philosophy until I got out of graduate school. I just thought I was doing philosophy, and this is what we did, and read Heidegger and do this
Yeah.
kind of like aporias and the limits of language, and I was like, oh, this is amazing. And then I got on like, who are these guys? These guys are like mathematicians
Oh
who
yeah.
like this is not what I'm doing. And so I think that's a nice little divide there, right? What is the final objective of an analytical philosopher in general? It's just sort of to nail down a certain kind of proposition, and not just to do it in language, but then sort of trot out some equations and some logical sort of that's wonderful. But a kind of you read somebody like a Derrida or somebody who is sort of the outcome is different, right? It's moving you in a different space where you begin to sort of, I don't know. I always talk about it as not a divorce, but a kind of just you begin to you don't lose your language absolutely, but you begin to there's room. Something happens between you and the words you're using, right? That I find quite a valuable practice. And so, you want a ritual? I'll give you a ritual for all the listeners out there. If you want to have a religious experience that has nothing to do with belief, okay, go to your bathroom mirror in the morning when you wake up, or maybe wait before you go to bed. Stare in the mirror. Look at yourself. See yourself. And this is an old William Burroughs trick, and this is not mine, but it's a good one. Look in the mirror, stare at yourself, and begin to say your name over and over and over again while staring at the mirror at yourself, right? At some point in that process, something's going to happen to this kind of tight triangle between a literal sort of optical vision of yourself, um, your experience of yourself, and the language that denotes yourself. There is going to be at least a rupture, or at least a sort of shakiness, right? And I think this is, how about that for a practice, right?
Yeah.
How about that for a practice?
It's funny, even as you say that, I think, and there's even like a built-in safeguarding mechanism where the kind of person who rejects what you're saying would start to feel that process work, and would kind of self-police and even maybe stop and just say, oh, this is weird and it doesn't work, right? Before they get to that point.
Yeah.
And it's a lot of it is the willingness to push through and to experience this, and the openness. I don't know if that makes sense. If
Well,
that's
it does
track,
make
yeah.
sense, right? And it does come down, like, some of my students are like, particularly in this moment, I teach at a small liberal arts college, and you would think that this was the last bastion of a certain kind of like, oh, like we're going to read like Kant on the lawn and, have these large, conversations. And, there's many students who still want to do that. But, a lot of students here at F&M, but other places are like, I need to be taking your class. I need to learn something. I need to learn something that's going to be applicable into my internship this summer, which then I'll get a good rec and I'll do this. And it's just kind of caught up in this sort of space. And, I often, it's often premised, right? The promise of find yourself, find your voice, find who you are. And I understand that, right? You're 18 years old and There's a certain anchor that you need, right? I totally get that. But there's also something about this culture that is really, really invested in you finding yourself and finding yourself in a very particular way. And to the point where that finding and that self can be, in a sense, perpetual generators of capital, right?
My day job is as a digital marketer. And so, like, I mean, what I mean is like, how do you find yourself? Well, it needs to fit into a branding package. Once you have that unique, personal, sellable branding package, that is your voice. I mean,
Yes.
Unfortunately, it's kind of what I do for a living. We won't talk about that, but
No.
it's like, I mean, I know what's happening. Yeah. Yeah. Part of what, and we've talked quite a bit about the Neuromatic project kind of being disembodied, if I'm tracking with you, right? Like this, or trying to be disembodied.
It has a push, right? And so, one of the things about the book, I'm trying to always embody it. I'm always trying to sort of, like, that opening chapter is incredibly confessional. I'm telling stories about myself and my grandmother and revealing details about me that you could judge me, right? You could judge me as a reader and be like, I don't know about this guy, right? But there's something about that particularity that I put up against this kind of incredibly massive universalizing project to be like, this is religion and this is your brain. And I'm like, no, man. Like, there's something about, you're missing something. You're missing something. This picture does not encompass it, right? And I always find myself like, a romantic plea. I don't think I'm a crass romantic, but I do want to keep at least it open for the possibility of a kind of romanticism to be possible. Because I find the other party very boring. I don't want to go to that party, right?
Yeah, maybe instead of a crass romantic, you're a carnal romantic. Like just
maybe
like
a carnal romantic, right? Yeah.
Yes.
No. And that's like, and that's the kind of thing, like, what I love about, there's a huge section of my book on Lee Garrett, a famous international parapsychologist in the mid-20th century, founder of the Parapsychological Research Foundation. And, she's really awesome because she's really sort of, doing her sort of, communicating with different kinds of entities in the past and, doing seances and whatnot. And she's doing it according to these, like, language of information theory and things like that. But she's also really weirdly always sort of mentioning and name checking the physical conditions under which she's doing it and her body. And there's something I kind of put that out there, not again as an alternative to be like, this is a different trajectory outside, but it just cuts slightly differently from, some of the more sort of straightforward, like, what, we are going to arrive at a space where we can understand you completely and fully as a kind of neural processing entity.
Dr. Modern, it has been absolutely awesome to have you on. Is there, not that you should summarize all of this because it is both phenomenal and huge, but is there, if you could give a single takeaway for our audience, something for them to carry away from this conversation, what would it be?
I would say my quick thing is like, know your history. Know your history. Know your history. And also a shout out to, you mentioned at the beginning, the project I'm working on now, which is sort of most exciting to me, which sort of takes these ideas in different directions, but also includes over 100 other collaborators, artists, and other scholars and musicians. It's called Machines in Between. And it's an experimental audio series that we're about halfway through it. And it's a experimental audio series that sort of thinks deeply about our sort of engagement with technology, and it's premised upon the question of what do you love when you love your machine, which your readers or your listeners might recognize as a kind of take on Augustinian, a kind of theological inquiry. What do you love when you love your machine?
I'm not going to lie. I actually had down here to ask about it, and then I looked down at the time, and I was like, that is not a 5-minute conversation. So, yes, I would love to.
Yeah. We have great stuff. I mean, it's an experimental thing, and it is this thing where, trying to push, as we say, the boundaries of scholarly inquiry. We're trying to be as smart as we are any place else, but to do it in a way that does have a lot of fun and also sort of, hopefully appeals to people who don't necessarily, don't have PhDs, right? Who are just interested people and interesting people. So
I wanted to call
check
it
out.
interdisciplinary, and then I realized it's broader even than that because it's outside the academic world, and that's I think a wonderful thing. So, Dr. Modern, again, thank you so much, and it's been a pleasure having you.
Thank you so much, PJ.